So I don't know if anyone knew about this, but there's currently a really bad housing crisis coming out at the moment, right? What with what's happened with the Bank of England raising interest rates, and that's affected people's mortgage. They're going to be increasing next time they have a rate shift, which means that they'll be paying extra 200, £300. Some people even more than that, right? But that's also going to affect people who are landlords who are going to be putting rent up on people. Because the mortgage that they pay has gone up, whether or not it's a buy-to-let mortgage, whether it's a regular mortgage, they are now going to be paying an increased mortgage payment, and that cost is going to get pushed onto renters. Now, I've talked a lot on my channel about how I'm incredibly frustrated with the political media class for completely ignoring renters throughout this entire situation. It's always been about people. Renters never get talked about in that equation. Now, the reason they don't get talked about in that equation is because they're not a voter class that ever changes hands, right? The real people who are the swing voters that people actually want to be able to pander to are mortgage holders, right? Because richer mortgage holders are pretty solidly Tory, but there's a kind of middle ground of middle class people that are potentially swing voters, whereas the vast majority of renters all vote Labour, and they have done for very, very long times. They're not a political football people need to pander to. The renters have been completely avoided in the entirety of this crisis. Now, there's a certain class of people, chat and future YouTube viewers, who are renters and also conservatives, and these people are called conservative commentators. And I've picked out a good few of these people who are getting incredibly frustrated at this housing crisis. So let's have a look at this person. This person's called Christian Calgie. This guy is the senior reporter for Guido Fawkes, which is like a Tory Westminster. Let me scroll that down a bit, then also make it slightly smaller. So a kind of a Tory Westminster gossip rag. Very awful. I hate Guido Fawkes. They're continually anti-climate. They're climate change deniers. They essentially they pick their political battles based upon like perceived hypocrisy, like most conservatives do, and I find that intensely irritating. But anyway, I digress. Right, this man has tweeted out today. He spent a third of his income on rent minus bills, and just spent 2 hours and a 750 milliliter spray bottle of bleach wiping black mold off my bedroom wall for the second time this year. God, I love renting in London. So, this is somebody who rents. And I would like to make the case that this man got exactly what he fucking wanted. This man is a conservative. He voted for the Conservative government, and the Conservative government are uniquely to blame for the issues with the housing crisis that we have now. Not just the current Conservative government, but also the previous Conservative government, the government of Thatcher, and also, to a lesser extent, the Blair government as well. But they're also very much to blame, and I'm going to be attacking them in this video too. But if you continually vote Conservative, given what they've done with regards to the housing supply in this country, then you did indeed get exactly what you wanted. For example, especially if you voted Conservative in 2017 and 2019, right? I blame Labour a lot for this stuff because they're just as complicit in what's happened with the housing market over time in this country. But there is one Labour leader who was different on this regard, and that was Jeremy Corbyn, because they pledged a huge new house building program of mostly council houses in the 2017 and 2019 manifesto, right? And if you're watching my channel, then you already know full well that I believe that council housing is the best solution to the crisis of housing in this country, right? And believe me, there are plenty of people out on the internet who are conservatives who are saying the issue is the fact that we have a supply shortage. Now, I am not going to disagree with that particular precept around the supply shortage of houses in this country, right? That is a segment, that is at least something about this that we can both agree on. For example, right? Here is Tom Harwood. My rent has gone up 50% since I moved in 2 years ago. What people with mortgages are worried about now is what people who rent have been facing for years. It's not a function of anything other than a housing market regulated to destruction. Well, the first two parts of this tweet are very, very interesting. And all the third part is interesting for a very, very different reason. His rent has gone up 50% since he moved in 2 years ago. True. What people with mortgages are worried about now is what people who rent have been facing for years. Very true. That's a very interesting observation, Tom, in that it's very, very true that liberal homeowners have never had to care about the issue of their housing costs, whereas renters have had to care for their issue of their housing costs for, a decade, possibly even longer than that, because house prices have continually skyrocketed out of control for so long, for a huge amount of time. That's been a big issue for these people. What I'm going to take issue with is his claim here that the housing market is regulated to destruction. Now, there are certain regulations that are bad. Right? If you look at this, what's happened is, I need to talk about why we have so many planning regulations in this. It's also interesting in that there were supposed to be changes to planning regulations in the Conservative manifesto that have now been dropped. There's an amendment by Theresa Villiers going through. I think Robert Colville was talking about this here, that Calgie even retweeted. How they're going to be trying to remove a bunch of things that were going to be put forward to try and make building easier, to try and make building harder. And the reason this is a thing called a NIMBY. Now, that stands for Not in My Backyard, and it's a class of homeowner who explicitly want to fight against new housing provision in their area because it will impact their house price and make might make my town full of the poors. We might attract the poor people into my town here when I don't want people to be housed. I want to protect my own assets at the expense of the rest of society. I am an anti-NIMBY. As you may well be aware, if you're a long-time viewer of this channel, I absolutely despise NIMBYs. Because they're selfish. They're selfish people, right? Who will fight against the betterment of society for their own financial gain. Now, where might these NIMBYs have come from? You may ask. No, Justice, how do we have such a group of people who A, have all these houses, and B, think that the way that they do? Well, let's cast your mind back to the 1980s. The dawn of Margaret Thatcher, the dawn of neoliberalism, a fundamental ideology based on individualism and the desire for individual growth, which is otherwise known as selfishness. You can perfectly care about being an individual, and that was something that definitely Thatcher, definitely in a liberal sense. For the 80s, people did believe in their own personal self-betterment. That was true, and that was a good thing. However, what neoliberalism taught people was the primacy of the individual over all else, right? And society is now worse because of it. We have trained people through neoliberal policy to be selfish, right? As I mentioned before on stream, Thatcher is even quoted as saying, "Economics is the method. The goal is to change the soul," and that's what they did. By marketizing everything, by turning everything into a competitive marketplace, people have been taught by economic ideology to treat the individual as being the fundamental building block of society rather than society in and of itself. And it taught people to be selfish. Now, one of these ways that they tried to do this with people, and actually, I can understand why they did this. There was a policy in the 1980s called right to buy. Now, we used to have a big social housing sector in this country. For example, in the 1970s, we were building hundreds of thousands of council houses every year. And both Conservatives and Labour governments alike were doing this on the fundamental reason that it was better for society if we had more houses. These houses were done by the state to ensure that people always had access to a place to live. That was a thing that we had. We can discuss forever on the quality of these council houses, or the quality of the council estates. We could talk about that forever, but the fundamental position that the state can provide housing to ensure people are housed is fundamentally a good one as far as I am concerned. Okay? Now, what happened in the 1980s with the policy of right to buy is that the councils were given permission by the Thatcher government to sell off their council property to the council tenants at dramatically decreased costs. They dropped the costs of these things to be able to sell them to people that have the right to buy their own council house. Because I think, from a reasonable perspective, I don't necessarily disagree with what Margaret Thatcher was doing here when she said that by giving somebody their own house that they would take care of, it would make them more responsible people in general, responsible members of society. And I don't necessarily think that fundamental precept is inherently bad. The problem is that the main thing that was supposed to happen is that the revenues generated by selling off these council houses were supposed to be used to build replacement properties, so that the overall supply of houses increased and more people were homeowners, and there was also social housing to replace it. That never happened. What actually happened is that people bought these houses for cheap. They were never replaced by the councils. So we had a massive transfer of housing from the public sector into the private sector. We further marketized housing. We turned it into an asset for people to be able to try and build up their own sense of wealth, increasing their asset wealth, give them something other than their labor that they want to be able to generate additional economic value from. Lady Dread the Glitterius, welcome to the No Justice stream. Thank you very much for the follow there. That's much appreciated. Now, the issue with this is once you've created this class of people who now have an asset rather than just their labor, they now have been essentially gifted social mobility through government policy. And as Belvoir P in chat rightly points out, this has now sown even further divisions, because now people have changed their own economic needs. Rather than specifically being their main focus being around the work that they do, the amount of wages that they get from the work that they now have an economic desire to see their house price increase over time. And this cohort of people is actually a really large cohort of people, and that it was you could argue cynically that this was done by the Conservatives to create a new generation of Conservative voters, because homeowners in general do vote Conservative, and we've seen that for a very long time. This point is going to be important, viewers, about what happens when you become a homeowner and what that does to your voting patterns, and how that has affected housing policy today. So, fast forward to 1997. There's a huge cohort of people who are now homeowners. If you want to win an election in the UK in the 90s, and basically ever since, now that so many of these houses are not, there are now far fewer social renters than there ever were. In fact, it was only in 2011 that private renters overtook social renters. Fact there. That's how far we had to go under that paradigm, shift things over. That's how many people were in social renting before all of this stuff kind of really. Fast forward to 1997, we have a Labour Party under Blair. They changed their platform significantly. Labour Party being a social democratic party for a very, very long time, but then became a third way neoliberal party because they explicitly want to have a centrist platform to try and woo over conservative home-owning voters that were gifted that through the right to buy policy in the 80s. Because for better for worse, you could not win an election unless you got this cohort of people to vote for you. Unless you had this cohort of people voting for you in the election, you were going to lose. So, you can somewhat, in some respects, not really blame Tony Blair for what with this policy specifically. Because actually, it was interesting if you look at the graphs, the Blair administration built fewer council houses than Major and Thatcher and even Boris Johnson, right? Although, to be fair, you can't really apportion this to Boris Johnson when actually it's mostly Labour councils in London that have built council houses over the last couple. But I digress. In this period, where Labour were courting these voters, they never built council do it. In 2004, we built 102, when considering we were building hundreds of thousands in the 70s. That's a huge difference in the level of housing supply and also where those houses are going. So, now we have the background about what's happened to our political sphere due to shifting housing policy and how that's essentially become mainstay policy right now. We don't build until very, 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 very recently. We're never building any council houses at all. Now we do have a planning issue. We do have a planning issue in that planning laws are restrictive because they give too much power to people to be able to stop new developments happening, and that power is going to be increased by this new amendment that's being proposed by Theresa Villiers. And the problem that we have is that because this electoral cohort is so large, the Conservative Party can never, ever, ever, ever support house building. We see it in the electoral results since 2019. We had by-elections. You look at Chesham and Amersham as a by-election. They fundamentally conservative seats in the southwest, fundamentally conservative seats, and they lost these by-elections because the Liberal Democrats were fighting them on these proposed planning reforms about loosening planning restrictions to allow more house building. Right? The Liberal Democrats fought on maintaining the existing planning system that would have stopped people building, and beat the Conservatives. So now the Tories are very, very scared. This is why the Theresa Villiers amendment is happening, is because the Tories know that their electoral platform is being fought upon from both sides. And actually, for once, we had a Conservative Party with a good house building platform. Boris Johnson, well, not a good one, but an okay one. Boris Johnson wanted to build more houses. The Johnson administration, at the very least, wanted to build more houses, right? They wanted to at least build houses in the private sector. Now, that's a problem, but we'll come on to that later. But because of the electoral coalition that they now have, and because of the results of these by-elections, they know that they cannot pursue this planning reform any longer. Now here's Robert Colville. He helped write the 2019 Conservative Manifesto. He is a writer for the Times and a think tanker, and someone who I vehemently dislike. But he's correct in one single thing that he's saying here. he says here, we all know that British politics, economy, and society is hopelessly and hilariously biased against the young. True. And he warns in his column today, a high-profile gang of Tory MPs is aiming to make things unimaginably worse. On Wednesday, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill returns to the Commons. Among the amendments we'll be asked to vote on, these are from Theresa Villiers. Their effect will be to eviscerate the current planning system, to make it essentially harder to build new houses. And he says Tory NIMBYs want to scrap housing targets. Remember during the Conservative leadership election, where Liz Truss was talking about Stalinist housing targets? This is the Conservative base. This is the Conservative base that was built up in the late 80s, early 90s, and by continuing failures on housing policy from the Blair government, right? You look at Blair's housing, house prices under Blair, and the amount of the house prices skyrocketed under Blair. They continually won elections off the back of a middle class whose housing asset value was continuing to increase at the detriment of everybody else in society. Right? Like, this is why it's impossible to buy a house now as a young person, because of policies put forward by Blair to try and win elections based off of the knock-on effects of policy by the Thatcher administration that have continued to this day, right? Until 2017, where Jeremy Corbyn said, fuck this shit, build loads of council houses, I don't care about NIMBYs anymore, you can go fuck yourself, right? Which is good policy, but, didn't quite, win the election. So even the problem that you have is that Robert Colville can scream until he's blue in the face about Tory NIMBYs being selfish and wicked, and I'm like, tough shit. You are the one who is happy with neoliberal policy platforms, the ones that we have seen in the changing society over the past 40 years or so has made people selfish, has destroyed the social contract, has made people only think about in their own selfish terms, in their own individualistic terms. Right? And you're now saying, I can't believe that Tory MPs and members are being selfish and wicked. You taught them to be selfish and wicked. You literally taught them to do this, and now you're getting angry about getting exactly what you fucking wanted, right? Now, what I will say, we come back to Tom Harwood, this tweet here where he says, it's not a function of anything other than the housing market being regulated to distract. The problem that we have is that when you've got, for example, future planning proposals to build new houses, if you're doing it by the private sector. Now, the issues that we have are there are multiple issues with it. The first one, of course, is the definition of what affordable housing even is, right? Now, at the moment, there are now laws in place that decide that you have to have certain numbers of affordable houses in any development. The problem is that they're not actually fucking affordable. That's just a name. It doesn't actually have any kind of concrete understanding of what might actually be affordable to someone in the future. No, it really doesn't. Okay. The most commonly referred to definition of affordable housing is set out in Annex 2 to the National Planning Policy Framework. This is the definition used by local planning authorities when making provision within their areas to meet local demand and need for affordable housing. The definition incorporates social rent as well as a range of intermediate rent and for sale products. The Affordable Housing Commission concluded many of these products are clearly unaffordable to those on mid or lower incomes, and that is only going to get worse as house prices continue. Again, they continue to have to. And the damage has been done. They coddled boomers who got cheap houses for decades and decades, both Labour and Conservative governments alike, to win elections. We coddled them with policies. The house prices are now stratospheric, but we can't bring them down because otherwise we're putting a bunch of people into negative equity. And it's become such a lucrative asset because private investors have known this. The entirety of this period, they've known that governments have no choice but to make sure the house prices increase, and then they've bought houses with cash, which is now easier for them to do now that mortgage rates have skyrocketed because of the Truss administration. They buy houses with cash as they're an appreciating asset because it's politically unviable for any government to change that. And it's only making things worse. And as I was mentioning to Bilderberg on stream the other day, older people are not going to be able to pass their houses down to their kids anymore because they're going to have to sell their extra houses to pay for social care. Under Blair, the amount of people with multiple property wealth ballooned, right? These are mostly accidental landlords, people who inherited houses from their Gen Xers and boomers who inherited houses from their parents when they died. But they didn't. They had proper NHS at the time, so they didn't have to sell their house to pay for social care. They also had defined benefit pensions and things like that. Now that's going to get worse over time. But the problem is that not only are these houses that we're building in the private sector not affordable, but they're also bad. The private sector has no incentive to build good houses, right? I live in a house that was built in the 1930s, right? This is a really good house. It's stood the test of time, been around for 90 years, and will continue probably the rest of my lifetime as well. The council houses that were built, right, in the 1960s, 70s, for example, and earlier than that too, they're excellent houses, still going alive today, all built to good plans to ensure satisfactory living conditions for people. In fact, there are prefabs built from the war and post-war period in Bristol that are still there today. Right? They were meant to only to exist for 10, 15 years, for example, 10, 15, 20 years, to then be replaced through slum clearance policies that would then build proper council housing on top of them. But they were so well made as temporary housing that they're still around today, and they're probably better overall for standing the test of time than new developments do nowadays. The reason why they're not good is because these private contractors that are building these new, they have zero incentive to make these things last long, right? I'm sure people in chat and people who watch my channel have heard of the idea of what's the what's the word I'm looking for? Planned obsolescence. That's the term I was looking for. Fucking hell. Just planned this particular segment before I started doing it. It's been ranting for a while now, but I digress. Um, Planned obsolescence is something that is now being built into new builds. Right? If you have built a house that lasts 100 years as a private company, you're never ever ever going to get another contract to build on that land ever again. So why would you? Why would you build something that stands the test of time, where you could build something shoddy and shit that has to get replaced? Whilst your company's still, whilst the private sector is still around. There is no incentive for the private sector to build things to last. And boomers will say this all the fucking time. They'll say, "Oh, my things. Why is nothing ever built to last nowadays?" And I'm like, because it's not profitable. Welcome to the profit motive, right? There are people in Russia still using hair dryers from 40-year-old hair dryers from the Soviet Union, because at least for all of the failings of the Soviet Union, right? Housing was built, housing still exists, and all of the stuff that was built to last because it was built for utility rather than profit, right? Now, I'm not saying that the UK should become the Soviet Union, far from it, right? But it's a really good microcosm of the issues with how profit motive affects the actual utility of the commodities that we buy. And how it makes things, in at least in certain circumstances, it makes things way, way worse. And this now is applied to housing. So with Tom Harwood saying, what we need to do is become even more libertarian, right? We just need to build more, let private companies build more houses. They're not going to be good houses. They're not going to be affordable. And all they are just a cash grab for private companies, because that's who he essentially represents, right? He's a journalist for GB News, and their platform of representation is on the back of Legatum and Marshall Wace, private equity firms and hedge funds, right? So why would he have any? He has. Why would he have any political prescriptions to be able to help the working class? And as Neil calls parody head in the responses here says, your landlord is always going to charge you the maximum rent that he possibly can. Your market is one in which he has all the power and you have none. Therefore, you will pay whatever you're told to, which is exactly what happens when you give landlords all the power. When the other function of social housing, not just because it provides stable places to live and cheap places to live, is it affects the market price for rent. If private landlords are having to compete with social rents to be able to provide housing, because there's plentiful social housing like there has been for a very long time in this country, then that makes private renters go into the private rental sector because they want to, rather than because they're forced to. But now there's no social housing. All of it is fucking decades long queues for social housing at the moment, and housing as a commodity has meant that we've had things like Airbnb take up residential properties. We're splitting up proper houses for families into HMOs, where landlords are trying to scrape every single last fucking penny out of the private rental sector. And because of the ballooning house prices and ballooning rents, the other thing that's happened now is that the state pays housing benefit to these private landlords to subsidise the fact that their rents are not affordable for the vast number of people in society. And the reason why they does that is because there's no fucking social housing. A, to bring the rents down, and B, for people who are poor to be able to live on the cheap. So now, instead of the state paying a bunch of money out to build a bunch of houses for poor people to be able to live in and then generate revenue back off that asset, we now have a state that pays that money in housing benefit to private landlords that they never fucking see again, because that money just gets spent on more additional equity for the landlord's portfolio. Like, this is you like, and these Tories are now saying, "I can't believe we have a fucking housing crisis." You got what you fucking wanted. This is literally what you wanted, and you got it. Like, you may not have wanted planning restrictions. You may have wanted more house building. You may have wanted all of these things, right? But you didn't want it enough to oppose neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is the problem that's caused this whole mess in the first place. The ideology that you support. You may have voted for something different, right? But the fact that you expected a political party that is explicitly successful off appealing to homeowners to actually affect those homeowners negatively by A, building around them, and B, making their house price go down. Like, the inability for these people to see the larger picture of the issues that they have, because they don't believe they're ideological. They don't believe they're ideological. They believe they're just pragmatic, right? When your ideology is going to inform you what you believe is pragmatic or not. Look at this, like this person here. This person is the deputy chairman of LGBT conservatives. Call me radical, but I don't think a housing market that forces asset-poor, cash-rich millennials to move 90-plus minutes away from their workplace, isolate themselves from their friends, cut out all luxuries like Netflix to save up £35,000 is a good economic model. Yeah, welcome to privatised fucking housing. You got what you wanted. Literally, you got what you fucking wanted. Time and again, I see the same suggestions, awfully deeply patronising, suggesting that I'm some kind of flippant, entitled, lazy person because I haven't been able to accrue any asset wealth, because around 40-50% of my salary since 2016 has gone straight to my landlord. Got what you wanted. You got what you fucking wanted. Or am I told to lower my expectations, don't aim so high, buy a house in Zone 8, commute in, get a studio flat or a one-bed, delay starting a family, opt into shared ownership, get a less well-paid job so you become eligible, all while more of my money funds my landlord? I mean, and this is exactly what they fucking wanted. This is neoliberalism incarnate, right here. Neoliberalism that gave us the promise of cheap fucking consumer electronics. Like, cheap treats. Treats was what we were sold neoliberalism would give us. Over marketization, just driving demand and driving supply of cheap luxury, whilst privatizing necessities, making our necessities incurably expensive. Because these markets are fucking inelastic as shit. Right? And now, these people are getting angry about the fact that the over-marketization of housing has led their house prices to make it impossible for them to get on the housing ladder. Both because of the electoral issues with home ownership and because of the economic issues with privatization and from the sale of public assets that they wanted. They got. They had the choice. Like, they had the choice of voting for Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. Obviously, he was never going to. Right? But there was that choice there of the man who said, let's build loads of council houses. Let's end fucking homelessness, right? Let's get people off the streets, right? I'm sure all of these Tories don't like living around homeless people. I'm sure a load of these Tories don't enjoy walking streets full of homeless people. None of us fucking do, right? Homeless people don't enjoy being homeless, right? But you are so committed to an ideology that punishes people that you don't like for things that they've not fucking done because you believe in the just world fallacy. You're happy to make your experience of your own town centre worse because you don't believe these people deserve housing. How fucking ridiculous of an ideology is that? And then you get up now, and now you're getting angry at an economic system that is making your landlord rich at your expense and making sure you never get in the housing ladder. It's your own fucking fault. Yellow Palooza with the follow. Thank you very much for the follow. Welcome to the Justice Street. I hope you're doing well. You've caught me mid-rant. We have to accept that it's even just economically, the system is holding us back in every way, stopping people from starting families, living near the jobs they want to, stopping them from spending money in the active economy. We need to be braver than this. We had a great shot to do something about this in 2020. We had a good bill drafted by Generic, decisively voted by millions in our hugely popular 2019 manifesto. Boris weekly shelved it, running scared from NIMBY Lib Dems, scaremonger about overdevelopment and blue. And the sad part is he's fundamentally correct. Fundamentally correct. But if you wanted to do that, you should join another political party. You'll never get it from the Conservatives. You'll just never get it. No, you'll just never get it. And Robert Colville in his article is just saying that, the Conservative Party will face electoral wipeout because young people can never, ever, ever vote for it. And I'm like, yeah, true. Change your ideology. Join a different party. You want house building, you're never going to get it from the Conservatives. And you're probably not going to get it from Labour now either, because they're now also dependent on this same cohort of people who own houses. And it's all down to a neoliberal ideology that taught these people that making their house price to go into the stratosphere was more important than social cohesion, was more important than providing a future to their fucking children. They're putting their house price above their own fucking kids. And as Gary's economics says, like your grandkids are going to be poor. They're gonna be fucking poor. They're gonna have a house. Your house is gonna get sold to pay for social care and be bought by BlackRock or TSB. And we could have got the solution. Council housing, council housing, Jeremy Corbyn, because that would have transformed us to sort of the society that we had before neoliberalism, right? We could have started that societal, economic, and social transition back towards the post-war consensus that we had before. Now, not gonna fucking happen now. We're just gonna have endless death spiral of neoliberalism for, another 7 years at the very least. This is another random crisis that caused Keir Starmer's government to collapse. We're just not going to get it. And I'm sorry to doom pill you with this video, future view, but we have no party that is providing this alternative. No party is providing the alternative. Because they can't. They just can't. And this is not going to solve itself. Unless young people, you, young person watching this, I've told you why the system is broken. It's not going to get broken unless you go out and fix it. You go out and agitate for it to be fixed. Tell political parties that you will not vote for them unless they provide proper social housing moving forward. Because it is unfortunate that it's become a war between generations, but it's been created by consistent policy from every government for the last 43 years. Unless that policy platform changes, we're not going to see proper change.